Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide for sitcoms, which if you are studying Media Studies GCSE will be on component 2 for the Eduqas Exam Board. In this video, I'm going to focus specifically on industries for sitcom, but there will be other videos uploaded shortly about representation, media language, and audiences and contexts as well. So check those out if you need some more information about those. Sitcoms, it's important that you have studied both the IT Crowd and Friends. Now, the IT Crowd set episode at the moment is the final countdown, which you'll probably be able to find online and is on Netflix as well. And you also need to have studied Friends, season 1, episode 1, and ideally probably the first 10 minutes of that show. But it would be wise to have seen the whole of that first episode to give yourself a bit more contextual information. And what I would recommend is perhaps knowing in general a little bit more about both of those sitcoms, so perhaps watching a couple of other random episodes and certainly studying the shows in more detail in general in terms of the way they were made and the funding, and we're going to go through all that industry stuff that might be relevant today. If you get an industries question for sitcoms, it is likely that you could be asked either about IT Crowd or Friends or both. And it will be a reasonably general question and not necessarily focused specifically on the set episode or the clip that you have had in the earlier part of that component 2 exam. So it's important that you don't just focus on that set episode of the IT Crowd and that you do know a bit more generic information about sitcoms in order to be able to answer a question about industries if it comes up. So on your screen at the moment is a list of all the things that you might need to know if you get an industries question about sitcoms in the exam. Might be worth having a look through this list. I'm going to try and cover as much as I can, but if there's anything you're not familiar with, then please do ask your teacher. So there's quite a lot of factual information that you might need to know for industries if you get a sitcom question. And that really is just a case of you guys having to take responsibility for doing some revision, maybe making your own revision posters or fact sheets or flashcards to try and make sure that you remember some of the key facts. It's important to know things like the companies that made them and where their funding came from. So, for example, the IT Crowd was made by a production company called Talkback Thames, and they worked with another company called Delightful Industries to make the IT Crowd. It was broadcast on Channel 4, and since it's been broadcast on Channel 4, it's now also on Netflix as well. Friends was made as a co-production between Warner Brothers, which is a really big company in America, and a group of writers called Bright, Kaufman and Crane, who set up their own production company as well. So they were the production companies. They then worked in conjunction to have it broadcast on NBC, which is a channel in America. When it was brought to the UK, it was broadcast on Channel 4. Subsequently, it was then broadcast on Comedy Central, and now is also on Netflix as well. So there's several companies and several channels that you're going to need to be aware of for both of those programs. And we're going to talk a bit about each of those companies and why they might be relevant. So Channel 4 gets quite a lot of its funding from the advertising slots that are in between each segment of their programmes. This means that they have some commercial interests, and it means that they are obligated to try and get as many people watching their programmes as possible, because the more people you have watching, the more you can charge for your advertising space. And so potentially that's why they buy in very popular programmes like Friends from America, because they know they're going to get a guaranteed massive audience and that hopefully is then going to make them more money. However, Channel 4 also gets part of its funding from the British licence fee, which means that they have what's called a public service broadcasting remit. Essentially what this means is because they get some of their funding from us, the public, they have a remit, which means they have kind of a contractual obligation to make sure that a lot of the programmes they show on their TV channel are a little bit alternative, a little bit different, not all mainstream, and that perhaps they reflect things like diversity, creativity, and that they could be considered maybe to be informative or educational as well as entertaining. And so it struggles, Channel 4, sometimes to marry up both of those ideas, the obligation to have these kind of public service broadcasting elements to their programmes, as well as making their programmes as popular and as mainstream as possible to appeal to advertisers. So they have to tread quite a fine line between being mainstream and alternative. And so perhaps you can see that in the way they've brought in a big mainstream program like Friends from America, but then they've also helped to produce and to distribute The IT Crowd, which is quite a niche British comedy. It's important to think about how programmes like The IT Crowd reflect the fact that it's been actually made by Channel 4 or made in conjunction with Channel 4 and Talkback Thames. So if you have a think about the fact that Channel 4 has this public service broadcasting remit, does The IT Crowd reflect that? It does have some diversity in it. There is a female character, Jen, and there is a black character, Moss. But you could say that perhaps it could be more diverse. Perhaps those characters may feel like they are token gestures to show diversity because that's something they're legally required to do. But certainly perhaps more diverse than other sitcoms, like Friends. Friends perhaps is not diverse at all if you look at it in terms of ethnicities or sexualities. You know, the characters are very white. Even the extended cast list really lacks any ethnic minorities at all. And so, you know, perhaps we could say that Friends doesn't really reflect the diversity requirements of Channel 4. But, you know, perhaps they showed it anyway because they knew how much money it would make in terms of advertising. So, you know, they're not always going to follow the remit all the time. The IT Crowd is quite niche in terms of comedy, and perhaps this does reflect the Channel 4 remit, their public service broadcasting remit, which is partly to be alternative and to be different. The humour used in The IT Crowd is often quite surreal, and some very strange things happen, both in the set episodes, so things like having a street countdown fight, and also in the rest of the series that are available. And it's that surreal humour that often attracted that quite cult niche audience. And so I think sometimes the content of The IT Crowd is quite niche and therefore does reflect the public service broadcasting remit of Channel 4. Channel 4 also has a commitment to developing and encouraging new talent, which means that they will often cast people who perhaps haven't been in a lot of stuff before. They will use new writers, new directors, and certainly The IT Crowd reflects this. The writer Graham Linehan was reasonably well known. He'd done quite a few other sitcoms before, but the cast were really quite unknown, with the exception maybe of Richard Ayoade, who had been in other programmes like The Mighty Boosh beforehand, but it was a very niche and cult following that those programmes had, so a lot of mainstream audiences perhaps might not have been familiar with him. So nurturing new talent and diversity is something that is part of the Channel 4 expectations that you can see reflected in the show itself. Now, in terms of funding for Friends, the companies Warner Brothers and the companies NBC as well, they are both part of massive conglomerates in America. They are vertically, horizontally integrated global companies with billions of dollars at their disposal, which means that they can afford to have quite a high budget series. And you can probably see this reflected in Friends and from what you know maybe about the rest of the series of Friends. So, for example, Friends is filmed in a studio. There's a big studio audience. They have what's called a multi-camera setup, so several large cameras filming at the same time to get different angles. They have a large team of writers. The cast were paid a large amount of money, not perhaps initially, but as the programme gathered popularity, Warner Brothers and NBC were able to pay their cast members $1 million an episode, which is a huge amount of money and was more than any other people were earning really on television or at the time. And so the benefits of having a company like NBC and their parent company, Comcast, involved in your programme in some way is that you have much more money at your disposal to make a much higher budget piece of TV work. The money also affects things like marketing and merchandise. They were able to play trailers constantly on television. I remember being about 14 and 15 and seeing the trailers for Friends on TV all the time in the UK. And so having shows like NBC and Channel 4 marketing the shows meant that they could market them really well. There was a massive range of merchandise available, you know, cups, mugs, t-shirts, bed linen, posters, the lot. And that merchandise was sold and was very popular. So it opens up another stream of revenue. They released a soundtrack to the show, and one of the songs that was the main title song, I'll Be There For You by the Rembrandts, was released as a single in several countries. And this was a great marketing tool because the music video for the song was the cast of Friends having fun, messing around. And this was a really good way of engaging the audience into wanting to watch the show as well. It's important to remember that the soundtrack and the song were released by Warner Records, which is part of Warner Brothers, who helped to make the show. So it's in their interests to create these extra synergetic pieces of merchandise and marketing, because ultimately all that money that they're spending is going to go back in their pockets when they make their profit in the long term. By contrast, the IT crowd didn't have any official merchandise at all. And that's potentially because it was a much more niche programme, much lower budget. And they just felt that producing merchandise wasn't, something that they could financially take a risk on. So there is no official merchandise for the IT crowd at all. Some companies try to cash in on the popularity of programmes and they make what's called unofficial merchandise. Now, unofficial merchandise is anything that has not been legally and officially endorsed by the programme makers. It is against the law, but people will do it anyway because they know they can make money from it. And there was a huge amount of unofficial merchandise made for Friends. And because there was no official merchandise made for the IT crowd, a lot of people made their own merchandise and a lot of companies took advantage by making t-shirts and mugs and pens that they knew would sell to fans of the show. Having a global company like NBC, Warner Brothers, Comcast being involved in your production also means that because they are global companies, they are able to negotiate really great global deals in terms of distributing Friends to other countries. Friends was broadcast in hundreds of countries around the world, and that is primarily not just because of its popularity, but because NBC and Comcast were able to do deals with other companies in other countries that they had connections with. So it's all about connections and power in the industry's topics. Actually, Channel 4 has a lot of connections as well. They are quite a big, well-known company, and they do have some global connections. And actually, the IT crowd has been distributed abroad, although for the most part, it's more to do with the rights being distributed abroad. So the rights to the IT crowd were sold to an American company, and a new production of the IT crowd was made with a new cast. The only existing cast member was Richard Ayoade, who plays Moss. And there was also a German version of the IT crowd with a German cast. And so this ability to franchise your program and sell it to other global companies for them to remake as their own is another useful way of making more profit. In contrast to Friends, the IT crowd had quite a low budget, but it is still filmed in a studio. It still has a live studio audience, a number of limited set pieces that they use. So, for example, Roy's flat. And so it's important to see that there are similarities in the production processes, but there are some differences as well. There is not a huge team of writers working on the IT crowd. It's basically Graham Lynham and a couple of other script writers that kind of assist him whilst he's directing. So it's quite different in that respect. The cast are not paid a lot at all. We don't know the exact figures, but certainly nothing like the £1 million an episode that the cast of Friends were getting. And so perhaps their lower salaries and the lower budget overall of the show reflects the fact that some of the funding comes from the British taxpayers and their licence fees rather than just advertising like Friends does in the US. Technologies in order to market the show have been quite useful for the IT crowd. So, for example, they did use quite a lot of social media. You were able to follow the cast and crew on Twitter and Facebook. They even advertised for extras on social media as well. So, for example, in the set episode, The Final Countdown, they advertised for all of the countdown extras on Twitter, and they just got real people to come along and dress up and be part of the show. So it was a great way for fans to get involved. But it shows how they're using social media to engage their target audiences. They also used technologies to help to distribute the programme as well, in particular to appeal to those target audiences. So when the IT crowd was first broadcast, it would be broadcast online first at like 10 o'clock at night, and then it would be shown on television the next day. So you have all these kind of very techie people who stay up late, in particular men who are interested in IT, who are going to watch it online first, so it appeals to them because they have got almost like a sneak preview, and then the rest of the country gets to watch it if they choose to on terrestrial TV on Channel 4. So the way it was distributed using technology is quite interesting as well. Friends didn't really use the internet or social media because the social media didn't really exist in the 1990s. Things like Facebook and Twitter didn't start until sort of 2005, 2006. And so it was very much before the time of social media, Friends. And so they very much relied on traditional marketing. So trailers, posters, and making sure they're using those traditional forms of marketing to encourage audiences to watch the programme and watch the next series. Sitcoms are big business. If it's a particularly popular, globally recognised sitcom like Friends, you can, as a company, sell the rights to that programme for millions and millions of dollars. So the final season of Friends was then, by that point, so popular and so expensive that NBC had to pay Warner Brothers $6 million an episode to show that final season on their channel. Likewise, when Channel 4 wanted to show the last 3 seasons of Friends, they had to pay £120 million to do so. So being able to syndicate your product, which means selling it or distributing it, giving the rights to somebody else so that they can show it, being able to syndicate your product to other channels and other countries is a great way of earning extra money for your company. New technologies have really helped programme makers to be able to get their products distributed even further. So if you have a think about things like Netflix and streaming sites like All4, it has meant that the IT crowd and Friends have been able to have been seen by millions of people all over the world. They can just access it from their computer anytime they want, access it from their television without having to stick to a schedule, without having to be in the same time zone. So new technologies like Netflix and All4 have really helped in terms of global distribution. However, it can also mean it makes it harder to regulate those programmes. Ofcom is the company that regulates TV as well as radio, and they're the ones for making sure there's no inappropriate content on television, and they will handle complaints from the public, and they will issue punishments to companies if they break the rules. And Ofcom have a number of ways that they've used in the past to ensure that young people didn't get hold of any inappropriate content. So they had the Watershed, which in the UK is a kind of imaginary time at 9 o'clock at night where you could show your programme after that time if it had more adult content. But before that time, it was imagined that children would be up, and therefore the programmes had to be a bit more family friendly. The problem with technology, of course, is that now you can stream on Netflix or All4 anytime of the day, and often without any kind of age verification in place. And so technology has made it harder for Ofcom to regulate sitcoms in that way. Regulation can also be quite tricky for older products, so your historical products like Friends, because the way and the things that are acceptable in society changes over the years. So if you've ever watched a sitcom from the 1950s or 60s, some of the humour, when we look back on it now, is actually quite outrageous. There's quite a lot of racist, sexist, homophobic jokes in very old sitcoms, and things they say things and they use words that would be completely unacceptable now. And that's perhaps why some of those sitcoms aren't repeated on television on a daily basis. Friends is shown a lot of the time, and since it's been on Netflix, has been introduced to a younger audience who perhaps might not have encountered it before. And actually, these modern audiences started to complain. They started to complain to Netflix and say that they weren't happy with some of the content in the show. In later series, in later episodes, there are several sexist jokes. There's a couple of homophobic jokes. There's a whole episode, in fact, there's a couple of episodes where they make transphobic jokes about Chandler's dad. So modern audiences who have grown up in a sort of more liberal world were getting quite offended by the jokes that were deemed as acceptable in the 1990s, but actually not so much now in sort of 2018 to 2021. And so regulation does get harder for historical products because you have to bear in mind that what might have been acceptable 20 years ago might not be acceptable to modern audiences now. Another problem with regulation is that online streaming sites like Netflix are not covered under Ofcom. So Ofcom has no power over Netflix and what goes on it. So if something goes onto Netflix that is incredibly controversial, Ofcom can't do anything about it. And so regulation has its limits with new technology, and that's something you need to be aware of too. Friends had a rating in America, which was a TV 14, which was their kind of equivalent of saying that anyone under the age of 14 it might be unsuitable for. And that's mainly because, you know, they discuss things like sex, alcohol, occasionally drugs, and they felt that that might not be suitable for a younger audience. But actually, in Britain, it was given a PG certificate, which basically says it's kind of appropriate for anybody. And so one of the difficulties with regulation is that every country has different rules, and what might be acceptable in one country might be completely unacceptable in another country, or vice versa. Sometimes if a show is really successful, the first thing that program makers think is, how can we make more money from this? So when Friends ended, they started a spin-off series called Joey, starring one of the characters, Joey, from the series Friends. And it was kind of his own story. And they thought, well, he's obviously a successful character in Friends. We'll make a new show just starring him, and it will be a way of opening up new revenue. All the audiences from Friends will want to watch Joey, and it will be just as good a success. And they were really hoping that it would make them as much money as Friends did. But Joey really wasn't a very successful sitcom, and actually it really started to lose millions of viewers after just one episode, and eventually the show was cancelled. And people said it wasn't the same. The reason people didn't like it was because Joey on his own was not what people wanted. They wanted the group of friends from the main series. So it wasn't a successful spin-off. But making spin-offs like this is a good way of trying to make extra money from a programme. Comedy Central was a channel that in the UK broadcast lots of repeats and reruns of Friends. And when they wanted to promote the show as being on their channel, they started an event called Friends Fest. And it was basically a kind of event that happened in the UK, although I think there were others organised in other countries as well, where Friends fans from all over the world could come and gather, they could share information, they could meet up, they could interact with each other, they could go onto the set of Friends, they could sit on the real sofa, they could do all sorts of photo opportunities, and it was a real kind of entertaining event for a lot of people who were like super fans of the show. Once the programmes were popular and successful, they were able to attract a lot of celebrities who wanted to kind of take part in the show, and this was also a really great way of engaging audiences as well. So hundreds of famous celebrities in America took part in Friends as cameo roles. So that is one-off, very small parts where they either played themselves or they played a different character just for maybe one episode. And it was useful in terms of marketing the show. It was always something that was mentioned in trailers for the next week's episode. But it's also just shows and demonstrates how popular the series was, and how the lots of famous people were drawn to the programme because they could see how popular it was and they could see the reputation it had, and they wanted to be part of that as well. Can work quite nicely as well if you're having cameo appearances, if they are from programmes that your channel or your programme maker, your production company, also makes, because this means that you're cross-promoting another one of your products, and which will inevitably make you more money. So for example, in the set episode of the IT Crowd, you have the actual presenters from Countdown appearing in the episode of the IT Crowd. Now Countdown is also a Channel 4 production, and so they are promoting another one of their shows with a similar target audience, which is going to make them more money and more profit in the long term. So cameo appearances and cross-promoting your other products is a really great way of potentially making more money for various reasons. As well as the production companies and the channels that were involved in both the shows, it might be useful to know a little bit about some individual crew members or cast members that might have had an impact on the show itself. For example, with the IT Crowd, Graham Linehan was the writer-director of the show. He had made and been involved in several other very surreal alternative sitcoms previously, like Black Books and Father Ted. And if you haven't watched them, they're on YouTube and you should. They're hilarious. But perhaps a little bit of a niche audience. They're not very mainstream. And Richard Ayoade had been involved in The Mighty Boosh, as had Matt Berry, and a variety of other sitcoms as well, like Nathan Barley, that were all very, very niche programs, but had a cult following amongst people who liked unusual comedy. And so getting them involved in the show, the IT Crowd, was a great way for Channel 4 to bring in those pre-sold audiences, either of Graham Linehan as a writer-director or of the cast, such as Matt Berry and Richard Ayoade. So you're using your cast and crew as a company to attract audiences, and that's just important to understand. With Friends, the cast were not well known at all. They had done virtually nothing beforehand and were new faces in the world of TV for the most part. And even the writers, Bright, Kaufman and Crane, they had been involved in a couple of sitcoms previously that had done okay, but this was their first big sitcoms. So they were all quite new faces, and therefore Friends was a little riskier for them as a show. But perhaps because they were involved in, being part of a big conglomerate company like Warner Brothers, it helped them have the funding and the ability and the resources to make the show anyway, even though they were not known at the time. Certainly, obviously, the cast became incredibly famous later on as a result of the series. So as the series went on, the cast became such a huge selling point for the show that it was very important for the channel to keep them around and make sure they stayed on filming Friends. And that is why the cast were able to demand huge salaries, £1 million or $1 million an episode per person. And so, the more famous the stars get, perhaps the more demanding they can be towards the production companies and channels involved. Because the costs of making TV like this and or buying the rights to TV like Friends are so expensive, companies have to find out a way of making that money back in some way. And the advertising slots in the ad breaks between the programme segments are a really important way of making that money. For example, the final episode of Friends, companies were paying several $100 million to get sort of 30-second advert in the ad break of the final episode. It's a huge amount of money, but people knew that millions of people around the world would see that show. Channel 4 also sold lots of advertising slots at a huge price for the advertising space in between Friends episodes. And they also managed to earn quite a lot of money from companies sponsoring the series. So, for example, when Friends first started out, it was originally sponsored by Weller Hair Products. Then, as the target audience got a bit older, it started to be sponsored by Nescafe Coffee and then Jacobs Creek Wine. And so sponsors of the programme will plough a lot of money in to have their brand featured at the beginning and end of every ad break. And so sponsorship becomes very important for companies as well in terms of making that money back.